This is the wisdom of old age, which may in turn become the thesis of a new culture. Such a view depends, of course, on the theory that cultures have a cyclic and organic pattern of growth, similar to the life rhythm of individual human beings, and that in a general way they pass through the stages of infancy, adolescence, physical maturity, spiritual maturity, or old age and death. If it is to continue, just as it is any longer, such a fate would be almost desirable. Already the Christian religion has belonged to two cultures, the Greco-Roman and the Western, and the former is absolutely dead and gone, while the latter is clearly within a few centuries of its demise, if some violent accident does not end it sooner. Moreover, the divine design literally expresses itself through natural laws, which are our description of the normal way in which God works. To be an expression of the mind of God, history does not have to move in straight lines. We recognize that theories of history belong to a highly speculative and uncertain realm of thought, depending on the dangerous but necessary art of generalization. But just as there was clearly such a thing as Egyptian culture, there is clearly, to a person who uses his eyes instead of the academic microscope, such a thing as Western culture. For Christ is not entered into the holy places made with hands, which are the figures of the true, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. Lose its desire to be, and as in imperial Rome wishes itself out of the overlong daylight and back in the darkness of proto-mysticism, in the womb of the mother in the grave. To identify the history of Christianity with that of a particular culture is quite disastrous to Christianity. For Spengler, this return to the infancy forms is purely nostalgic and fails to grasp the inner spirit. The natural mysticism of childhood disappears by degrees pre-crisis. The culture exploits its newly found powers on the physical plane, but in its enthusiasm loses touch with its traditional roots. Christian historians do not in general like this theory for two principal reasons. After the frustration of material expansion, a culture weary, reluctant, cold. For he sees that the second religiousness employs the springtime or infancy forms of religion, but does not seem to realize that they are understood in a new interior and spiritually creative sense. We can say, for instance, that the medieval period represents Western culture in its childhood only in a general sense, for in the outstanding minds of the period there are dozens of individual exceptions, although none of them wholly surpass the general mentality of the age. There is no question of analogy for cultures being composed of men are themselves biological phenomena, and we know that biological groups can die out as surely as individuals. Unless understood in this mature way, the traditional religion of the Church must seem incomprehensible and even superstitious to the modern mind. But the principles have been attacked with more oratory than reason. Because of his own exceedingly superficial philosophy of life, he so misapplied the basic principles of his historical theory that the principles themselves have been attacked as widely and as bitterly as their misapplication. The childhood of a culture normally has its roots in an older culture, from which it receives a traditional body of wisdom which is accepted on authority and understood in a naive, literal, and external fashion. This is true already of the man of courage, for he puts his life to the stake. That is to say, he plays with his life, which is indeed the current French and German way of expressing the same. Ordered to this as to their end, fixity. But again, he perceives the external symptoms well enough. The material of the second religiousness is simply that of the first genuine young religiousness, only otherwise experienced and expressed. Spengler, despite his limitations, has at least established its general principles, and even while following theories of history which differ from his Christian historians and philosophers, such as Berdyaev-Watkin and Sorokin, have advanced views of the modern crisis which imply the same practical consequences. The general characteristics of the four stages of the cultural cycle are as follows. One thesis. One, for reasons that will presently be given, we believe that our Western culture has reached the end of its physical expansion and vigor and is entering the latter part of its life, the period of old age and spiritual or psychological maturity. Christian philosophy doesn't make it necessary to suppose that we are steadily advancing to some future perfection, for in space and time we attain relative perfections only, and the glory of Christian history consists in their sum and integration, viewed from the standpoint not of time, but of eternity. When physical expansion and maturity reach the point of frustration, the culture returns to its traditional roots, and with the aid of all the experience gathered in its course of life, understands them profoundly and inwardly. It starts with rationalism's fading out in helplessness, then the forms of the springtime become visible, and finally the whole world of the primitive religion, which had receded before the grand forms of the early faith, returns to the foreground, powerful in the guise of the popular syncretism that is to be found in every culture at this phase. To meet the spiritual needs of modern man, the Church will have to present Christianity in a mature form, as distinct from the childhood form of medieval Catholicism or the adolescent form of Reformation Protestantism. Beyond this, their views as to the nature of the crisis and the future which it forebodes differ widely because of their varying theories of history and of the development of cultures. Such movements are indeed early signs of a second religiousness seeking an inner meaning behind traditional symbols. But the meaning which they discover is usually some form of pantheistic rationalism. Closely interrelated and inwardly complex as they are, it is obvious that individual cultures exist. Three but the ecosnal symptoms he perceives quite correctly, showing that the second religiousness appears in all civilizations as soon as they have fully formed themselves as such and are beginning to pass slowly and imperceptibly into the non-historical state in which time periods cease to mean anything. Vigorous philosophy rationalizes the tradition's external form, while mystical insight is fresh and deep, but improperly related to the tradition itself and to social life. Two antitheses. Imperialism and materialism flourish until they reach their practicable limits or collapse through loss of inner spiritual meaning. For synthesis. 500, 700 in China. It is obvious, however, that not all aspects of a second religiousness are of equal profundity. Along with Plotinus and St. To interpret the signs of the times, one is almost compelled to adopt a theory of history. And the one we have here chosen is unpopular because of the admittedly narrow and unfortunate way in which its chief protagonist, Oswald Spengler, has handled it. The spell of a Kend religiousness comes upon it. This period of infancy lies prior to 800 B100 and comprises the establishment of the original priestly religion and the primitive law and the founding of the nation in its Palestinian home. New cultures or may be active in the areas occupied by the old and among their descendants, but they are clearly new. There is no reason at all to suppose that our Western culture is exempt from this fate. If cultures have birth and death, it would seem probable that, like all other biological phenomena, they pass through the intervening stages of growth and decay. This is not the application of a biological analogy to history. This thing at first is that they have a myopic tendency to identify Christian history with the history of Western culture. And the second is that they feel it to be a naturalistic philosophy of history, obscuring the divine design behind human events. It is simply different in form and capacity, and no one will seriously maintain that adults are of necessity holier and better than children. The cyclic view of history involves no moral judgments whatever. The inability of many historians to discern the various stages of cultural cycles is due also to the confusion of the general mentality of a given period within that of its most exceptional minds, and to exclusively analytical methods of research and study which make it impossible to see the forest for the trees. For ye are not come unto the mount that might be touched and that burned with fire, but ye are come unto Mount Sion and unto the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. It would be shown further that the mature form differs from that of childhood in that it is an interior spiritual and mystical understanding of the old traditional body of wisdom. The thesis and mythos, too, with which the cultural cycle began, it is certainly possible by the analytic method to prove that they do not exist, because almost anything will seem to vanish when sufficiently reduced to atoms. The unity of Christian history must not be confined to a single culture, for this would not begin to exhaust the manifold possibilities of Christian civilization. The second religiousness begins after 200 with the frustration of an attempted political independence, and is seen in the wisdom literature, primitive Christianity, and such cults as the Essenes. We are not saying that modern man is the spiritual superior of his forefathers. We are saying that in important respects, he is of a different and older type of psychology.
One, but the reluctance of many to admit it, is due largely to our own culture's absurdly exaggerated view of its importance, and man's natural aversion to facing the fact that one day he will die.
The adolescent period is characterized by a growth of individual self-awareness and involves rebellion against the parental tradition and authority. The culture discovers its own peculiar powers and abilities and departs sharply from the patterns inherited from older cultures. As Christendom, it once had an almost perfect unity, though now its unity is buried beneath the excrescences of time. It is also obvious that these individual cultures come into being and pass away. Late Jewish culture produced the wisdom literature, Philo, perhaps the Kabbalah, 6 in primitive Christianity itself. Indeed, the Hebrew Judaic cycle is a particularly instructive example of the spiritual evolution of cultures having stages that are marked with considerable clarity. 8. Thus, in our own day, the profounder second religiousness of Western Christianity must not be confused with the modern Gnosticisms of theosophical esoteric Christianity, Christian Science, and other manifestations of that occultism which has little in common with genuine mystical insight. In all probability, there will be many Christian cultures following the late Greco-Roman and our own, all exhibiting the genius of Christianity in differing ways, like so many varied jewels adorning a crown. 7 examples might also be cited from the Oriental cultures, for we find the immense insight of Mahayana Buddhism and Sankhara's Advaita Vedanta in the latter phase of Indian culture, and the great Chan, or Zen synthesis of Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism after it. Indeed, the beautiful fact of cyclic movement is repugnant only to the discredited theorists of linear progress and to cultural egotists who suppose that their own culture form is essential to the continuance of truth, beauty, and goodness in the world. The important feature of this phase is that it gives a mystical and interior interpretation of the primitive religion of the law and the sacrificial worship of the temple. It is not our purpose to expound and defend this theory of history in detail. The profoundest spirituality of the human race appears during these periods of second religiousness. Late Greco-Roman culture gave us Plotinus, Origen, St. Augustine, and the great Byzantine fathers. To the same period belongs the Hebrew religious mythos contained in the earlier parts of the Pentateuch. Between 800 and 500, we have the adolescent revolution of prophetism, followed by the diaspora, which was for the Jews an era of economic rather than political expansion, since they became the bankers of the ancient world. Nothing new is built up, no idea unfolds itself. It is only as if a mist cleared off the land and revealed the old forms, uncertainly at first, but presently with increasing distinctness. Age and maturity may bring the weakening of physical powers, but they also bring wisdom. This mystical and spiritual synthesis, which occurs in the final maturing of great cultures, is termed by Spengler the second religiousness, though in spite of his otherwise profound grasp of cultural life rhythms, a certain emotional perversity seems to prevent him from grasping the full significance of this phase of development. What the child understood as an external objective and symbolic fact, the mature mind will see also as an interior subjective and mystical truth. What the child received on another's authority, the adult will know as his own inner experience. Today, the best minds among them are agreed that this crisis denotes the end of a phase of our civilized civilization, if not the end of that civilization itself. This is why church religion is finding it so hard to meet the spiritual needs of modern man, for it is treating him as if he was still a child, an adolescent, or even a young adult. Where are the dinosaurs and pterodactyls, and what is becoming of lions and tigers? Indeed, this is not even a question of biology, but rather of simple energy and movement, the patterns of which are almost invariably cyclic. The epoch of these spirit philosophers and historians have been saying for years that the Western world is in a period of acute crisis. But to say that cultures grow old and die is no more pessimistic than to say the same of persons. They would be quite horrible if they did not, for one who does not know how to die does not know how to live. Furthermore, this view of cultural development does not involve the idea that the mature stage is better than or spiritually superior to the stage of infancy. The relevance of this cultural rhythm to our particular problem, the spiritual crisis of modern man, is that if, as will be shown, we are now entering the phase of spiritual maturity, we are going to understand the Christian religion in a somewhat different way than in the past. It is conceivable that historians would not resist Spengler's basic theory quite so bitterly if they could realize, as he did not, that the closing phases of a civilization or culture are not times of pure decadence, especially from the spiritual point of view. 5. Spengler rightly states that our own civilization has not yet entered upon the second religiousness, but the purely regressive character which he ascribes to it is typical rather of such trends as the 19th century Gothic revival and the reversion of the Roman Catholic Church at that time to an extreme traditionalism and obscurantism against the rise of liberalism.
For Augustine, we have the complex but superficial theosophism of the Gnostics, while Philo is tedious and involved in comparison with St. John and St. Paul.
Naturally, there would be individual exceptions to this rule, for in every period of a culture's development, there are persons both before and behind the times.